Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen W. Long. This is The Writing Life. And if you have kind of been following along, we just did our 100th episode last time. And in that period, we've had really some special guests, and I'm very proud of that. But honestly, I don't think we've ever had a guest with a more important topic, more knowledgeable, and I'm just honored to have Christine Bader with us today. And her book, The Evolution of a Corporate Idealist, is, well, and I love the subtitle, When Girl Meets Oil. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Christine, this is probably obvious, but what's the definition of a corporate idealist?
Oh, wow. Thanks for asking. That's a good place to start.
Yeah.
A corporate idealist is someone who sees the potential for
Okay.
business to be a force for good in the world,
Okay.
and wants to be part of making that happen.
Okay. That's almost a segue to later, but we're going to hold off on that. I have a little something that I want to get this out of the way.
Okay,
So you were in Indonesia.
correct.
If I say this right, can you speak Bahasa?
A little bit.
A little bit?
It's a fascinating language because
Yeah.
it was basically created in
Okay.
order to have some kind of unifying language for the 17,000 islands and infinite number of ethnicities and
dialects.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's sort of a manufactured language. So Roman alphabet, everything is pronounced exactly
Okay.
as it looks. To say
Phonetic.
something plural,
Yeah.
say something plural, you say it twice. There
Really?
are no tenses. Yeah. So it's easy to get conversational. That was really the point.
Okay.
But there are levels of sophistication and there are regional variations.
Yeah.
So I could get around.
I didn't know about the plural form.
Yeah.
What caught my eye was in the book you say
Yeah.
that it lacked tenses. And I
Yes.
wondered if that isn't a recipe for confusion.
It absolutely was. So,
Okay.
so I'm glad you picked that up because one of the stories that I shared in the book is when it makes it very hard to get things done. So for example, I was in the office and I
Yeah.
said, I needed a memo from somebody. And
Yeah.
I said, Booty, did you do that memo? And he said, yes, I do memo. Okay, did you do the memo or you're going to do the memo?
Will you do the memo?
He said, yes, I do memo.
Yeah.
Okay, can I see the memo? And then he sort of nodded and then he shook his head.
Someday.
Today?
Okay.
So yeah, you have to be a little bit creative in trying to get your point across.
Oh, I love it. All right. Say one thing. Say hello. Say good morning.
Oh, selamat pagi.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good morning.
Okay. This book, folks, is just, you got to get it because it's just so interesting. But given the scope and the complexity of what you were doing, in fact, maybe we should back up and say, what were you doing?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, how far back do you want to go?
BP.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I went to business school after a couple of years working in nonprofit and government jobs
Okay.
out of college. And in those jobs, I started to realize that companies seemed really powerful. They seemed to be
Absolutely.
shaping a lot of the conditions that I was reacting to
Okay.
in these other jobs. So I started to wonder about business, like who are these business people and why are they so powerful? Why do they have such an outsized influence on our lives? So I thought one good way to learn about that would be to go to business school.
Okay.
Yeah, so I went to business school, but I still didn't really know, like, what did I want to do? What kind of jobs were
With this
there where I
tool,
could
now
really,
what?
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so the first year that I was at business school, John Brown came to speak.
Oh, boy. Okay.
And at the time, he was the CEO of what was then British Petroleum.
Right.
And now BP. He came to speak, and he had recently become the first head of a major energy company to acknowledge that climate change was real.
And what
This was
year
in the
was
fall
this?
of 1998, so this was a big deal.
Absolutely. Okay.
I mean, it's still a big deal, which is a different
No, but the
conversation.
acknowledgement is a big
yeah,
deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he seemed to be somebody who was thinking about his company's role in society different from everybody else, and I thought that was really intriguing.
Well, the way
Yeah.
that you paint him, I like him because I think you liked him.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Had a lot of respect for somebody who was being so deeply thoughtful
Yeah.
about his company's role in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that again, points to some of the premise of this: girl meets oil, girl falls in love with oil,
Right.
oil ends up breaking girl's heart.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
used the word, you said that we all react to what business does.
Yes.
And as you said that, it made me think of being proactive. And so now, in a way, you're inside and you can maybe guide a little bit.
That's the
Shape,
hope.
yeah.
That's the hope. That's the ideal.
Okay. So much to do here, but I wanted to talk about, I think that the name of this Chinese company is Sinopec?
Sinopec. Yes.
Sinopec, of course, Sino, yeah. And that one of your folks, construction manager,
Yeah.
was over there and trying to interpret or suss out a spreadsheet.
Yes.
Some of it was schedules and timetables
Yeah.
and so on,
Yeah.
but there was a number and,
Yes.
and not a translation.
Yes,
Can
that's
you-
right. That's
can
right.
you talk about
so
that?
yes, we're going through the spreadsheet. So I was working on a BP joint venture with Sinopec, which is one of China's state-owned energy companies. It was a joint venture, so everything was 50-50. So every meeting, there were half BP folks, half Sinopec folks in the room, and everything was done through a translator. Right.
Okay, yeah.
So the construction manager who I was working for, I was there to help ensure decent standards for the dormitories for the
Okay.
migrant workers. So you're right, we're looking down the spreadsheet and it's got timeline, budget, all these things, and then there was one number where the line wasn't translated. And so the construction manager says, "What's this number?" It was a number 8.
Yeah.
And goes to the translator says to the Sinopec manager, the Sinopec manager says something, the translator says, "That's the number of expected fatalities."
Yeah.
And my colleague said, What?
Yeah. You
8
can't- yeah.
expected fatalities?"
Right.
And the construction manager said, "Well, yeah, with this many man hours, it's 30,000 construction workers, it's going to be a 2-year project. That's about
Yeah.
right. We'll have 8 fatalities."
Right.
And Steve said, "The target is not 8.
Right.
The target is 0. And they said, "Well, that's not realistic." And Steve, the funny thing is, they were right in a way, right? Like
And,
they
and
were
I
just
suppose you could
projecting-
derive that statistically. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But we had to say that the target is not
Well,
8.
Let
the
me.
target is 0.
I think this was your compatriot said, if you lower expectations, they'll be met.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And trivia side note here, I know a little bit about the Hoover Dam,
Yeah.
and I thought that they did a lot of good things.
Yeah.
They were under budget, they were ahead of schedule and so on. And I know that there was some bad things that happened there,
Yes.
but I didn't know how many.
Right.
They lost 96 people. So, gosh, I mean this it could be a subject in itself.
Yeah.
In that has society advanced where that's no longer acceptable, and I think you're part
Right.
of that.
Right. Maybe, yes. In
Yeah.
some places, yes. In some, what's the cost of doing business?
Well,
to put it so horribly.
And I
Yeah.
think one of your chapters, in fact, is named that.
That's right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
this is it, right? I mean, this
Yeah.
is the acceptable because it's a cost of doing business. One of the examples that you gave was the Ford Pinto.
Right.
So can you just remind people what that was
Sure.
about?
I mean, that story, I obviously was not personally involved, but the Ford Pinto, which
Yeah.
some people will remember better than others, that there was a bit of a scandal. I think this might have been where Ralph Nader, right? Did Ralph Nader set his sights on this? I'm not sure. But
Unsafe at Any Speed.
yeah.
That was his book. It was more,
Yeah.
I thought it was targeted at the Corvair.
oh, okay.
the Chevy
okay.
Corvair, but-
Well, the Pinto, I mean, Ford came under fire because it turned out
So to speak.
so to speak, that they failed to install some safety mechanism in the car because they figured that it would cost this much, but if it caused X fatalities, they would probably get sued and it would cost them this much.
Right.
And looking at it strictly from a numbers perspective, cost-benefit analysis, they thought, that's all right,
Yeah.
we'll take the chance.
Boy, I'm departing from the script here, but I have to ask you, do you think that, again, have we moved forward culturally? Is that kind of thinking not in the boardrooms now, or do you think maybe it still is, but just not talked about?
I think it still is.
Yeah.
I think it still is. I think you're right that the degree to which people will admit or say it quite so blatantly,
Right.
we're not in the same place anymore. But I think that cost-benefit calculations happen all the time, right? That's just the way the companies operate.
Well, I think profitability is certainly, that's almost the definition of
Yeah.
business. You talked, this all ties in, this analysis. The argument could be made, has been made, that let's observe human rights from a financial standpoint. Except that I think you say that the dollar and cents approach can undermine the thrust of that argument. So, and what did you mean by that?
Well, it's actually exactly what we were just talking about, which is to say that if you get into this argument where you're saying, well, is a human life worth this much, or maybe is it worth this much, we're kind of missing the point here.
Right.
Right? So if we're making proposals that cost this much, and I was having these conversations of saying, look, there is a risk that working in this environment with this government, that we could be complicit
Right.
in human rights abuses. And I'm proposing, that we spend this much money, and that will hire us, this many staff, it'll fund this many programs, and then it will prevent, some of the worst case scenarios that we're talking about. I don't really want to get into a conversation where they're saying, well, I get what you're saying, but if we cut that budget in half, does that mean that there's a 50% chance that we'll be complicit in genocide?
Oh my gosh.
Like what?
Now you interpret, that that's what they're thinking, but nobody said that, I hope.
No, nobody said that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, I'm going to leap ahead a little bit and think about the frustration. I'm going to call it frustration. Maybe you saw it differently. The uphill battle in what you're doing. And I want to get this right, that there's no reward for what doesn't happen.
Yes.
And it reminded me when I read that, I thought about, the fellow who joined the Navy and is stationed in Omaha and says, I did my job, we didn't have any Navy attacks in Omaha. So how do you make that argument?
Yeah. That is one of the hardest ones, I think, because I interviewed somebody for the book. So the book is largely my story, but I weave in the stories of lots of other people doing the same kind of work in other companies.
Yeah.
So one of my interviews was with a woman who does supply chain management for a very large fast food company, and we were talking about this very issue. And she said that one year, the company's internal awards, which are a really big deal in a big company, right? You get
Sure.
to stand up in front of lots of people.
Recognition.
Yeah. She said that one of their awards went to a colleague of hers who managed a big safety disaster. So something happened, and he sort of dealt with the press and instituted new processes. And she thought,
What about me?
I've prevented 30 of those.
Right.
But how do you reward for that?
Yeah.
Right? So no good answer. Again, it's because so much safety work, ethics work, corporate responsibility, sustainability is about preventing bad things from happening.
Yeah. Which I think means that you have to have not foreknowledge, but you have to look ahead.
Yeah.
You have to anticipate what might happen. And to do that, you have a background knowing where things have gone wrong. That was, and this may not be right, but the shirtwaist fire,
the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York.
And that was, so the doors were locked.
Yeah.
But I think this is right too. I may be mixing up two disasters, but the doors in factories typically opened in. And so when there was a disaster and people wanted to get out, well, they couldn't open the door because the people were crushed up And so that there was a change because of that.
Right. That's
so
right. That was
I guess that's an
1917 or something.
an
Yeah.
example of learning from bad things and,
Right.
and making them better.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in
Yes.
2013, I think in Bangladesh, is when we saw a lot of the same basic safety failings, you know, that we have, hopefully, knock on wood, fixed here in the U.S. 100 years ago.
So I know about that, I read about it,
Yeah.
but I'm not clear. You say it's a safety failing. Was that a construction failing or was it something else?
Oh, gosh, I think it was many things.
Okay.
So definitely construction. There's also some statistic that some very high percentage of Bangladeshi parliamentarians have an interest in the apparel business. So Bangladesh has become one of the biggest sources of apparel manufacturing in the world. So no doubt some tag on our clothing today, you know, says made in Bangladesh. So
Okay.
there apparently was not a lot of interest in strengthening safety standards in the factories because that would add cost
Right.
and make that part of the supply chain less appealing to Western brands.
Okay.
Yeah.
This just one thing leads to the next. I think that would maybe be an example then of the resource curse or the paradox of plenty.
The resource curse traditionally refers to oil, gas.
That kind of resource.
Yes,
okay.
that kind of resource curse.
Not financial.
Not exactly, no. At least that's what it's traditionally been about. It's been about the paradox of a lot of developing countries where there is a discovery of oil or gas or minerals, attracts a lot of foreign investment. People rejoice, thinking that everybody's going to get rich.
Right.
And then it invites nothing but corruption, environmental degradation, and the people who are literally living on top of the resource
Right.
see no benefit from it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
BP moved a bunch of people. I think this was Indonesia.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. One of the many interesting things is lots of those people didn't live in the houses that were provided.
Yeah.
Talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yes. So when I joined BP and moved to Indonesia, BP had just bought Arco, in large part for the assets that Arco owned in Indonesia, including this one gas field, which was in West Papua, which is the eastern tip of Indonesia.
Okay.
And so in order to build the facility, there was a village living on the most feasible site. So the Indonesian government had long before decided, that's fine, just move them. Now, people have to move all the time for projects that their government deems to be in the national interest, right? I'm from New York City. People had to move to build the Second Avenue subway.
Okay.
Right? But there's a process that governments are supposed to follow. When that happens, people are supposed to be consulted, informed of their options, offered compensation if their livelihoods are impacted.
Right.
And when we got there, this discovery had been made by Arco some years prior, and the people had already picked the site that they were going to move to.
Oh, they did? Okay, I didn't realize that.
But it wasn't a good site. This was a fishing community, and it was inland. It was far from the water, and it was hemmed in the rainforest, and so it just didn't feel like there was no documentation of any consultation, so it wasn't clear that they had been informed of their options. So we undertook a whole consultation process. We built a model house so that they could be involved in the design. Like, it was a very extensive process. Built a beautiful new village, and then one of my last trips out there, we were flying over the area in a helicopter, and I saw some piles, what looked like some piles of corrugated tin behind one of the new houses, and I said to one of our guys, "What is that?" And they said, "Oh, well, some of the guys are living in these tin shacks and renting out their houses to some of the workers that have moved in." They had every right to do that.
I was going to say that for me, that's not a value judgment. It's just an interesting human thing.
Yep.
I can see some corollary that we would do. I can't think of an example at the moment, but use what you've got
Yep.
and make it work. Yeah. Make it work some
Yeah.
way.
So it's just one of the many examples of, a Western company coming in and trying to be very responsible and ethical and just really needing to understand and listen to what people want, which is something that Western companies are not very good at.
It makes me think, and we don't have to get into the nitty gritty on this, but when it went from British Petroleum to BP, and the Chinese didn't want to say that.
We can if you like.
This is an adult audience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of really needing to listen. So I was with the company and I was moving to China just at the time when, Kentucky Fried Chicken became KFC, right?
Yeah.
Like acronyms and initials were cool, right? So British Petroleum became BP. But by the time when I got to China, the company had rebranded. But when I got to China, all their stationery, their business cards, all said British Petroleum, and I said, "Did y'all not get the memo?
Right.
Like we're a new company now." And they'd sort of, nobody wanted to tell. People started acting really strangely when I would ask about it. So I finally asked one of my friends outside of the company. Yeah, there was sort of a snicker, but I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I asked one of my friends outside of the company who spoke Chinese, like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, well." With the wrong combination of tones and context, B means vagina and P means fart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they got a kick out of that.
Yeah. So this was not a great rebranding for the company. So it was exactly like, the Chevy Nova.
The Nova,
star.
yeah.
You're right.
Won't go.
Right.
I think this is right, and you would know better. There is a company, maybe there are several companies that develop a name of something because it means nothing. So, and I think Exxon, is one.
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, this is exactly why.
Means nothing in anybody's language.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So back to corruption, and to talk about the Coca-Cola plant, where the guy says we don't have a human rights problem.
Yeah. So,
and I'm trying to remember where it was in the South America?
It was in Colombia. Yeah. So at that point, I had left BP. I was working for the United Nations Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, who was charged with setting global standards for how companies should think about and embrace their responsibilities with respect to human rights. So as part of that, we were traveling around visiting sites, and we went to Colombia, where Coca-Cola had faced a lot of problems, and not just Coca-Cola, but in Colombia, there is violence, there is corruption,
sort of particularly.
Particularly against labor activists. So there were people who were trying to unionize, and people had gotten shot. And so our host had hosted this at his hacienda for lunch, and it was this very grand lunch with servants, and he was trying to tell us that there were no human rights issues there.
No problem.
No problem. And I have just built this town a water park. They are very happy.
Yeah.
And we knew full well what had happened.
Sure.
And so, these things still exist. And
there was another incident where somebody that you interviewed knew that there was sort of some shenanigans in the when they went to inspect, because everybody was pristine and on purpose that person left and said, "Oh, I forgot my something," and went back. What happened then?
Yeah, so this is a problem that definitely still persists today, of looking at factories that make our stuff all over the world.
Because they know you're coming.
Because they know we're coming, right? So we'll go through as a group, and everybody's wearing their safety goggles and has all the right gear on.
Right.
But then, 5 minutes later, you go back, and they've taken off the goggles and kept them nice and clean and neat in the box and put them back on the shelf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was, and I'm trying to piece this together if it was related, but a female inspector, I'm not sure, went kind of down in like a basement area and saw some young kids manufacturing something.
Yeah, so that was, I interviewed a friend who had worked at the Gap, and so he went on a trip to India, And he usually, typical practice, you'd hire a guide to sort of take you around, find all the addresses, and serve as a translator. And so they went to a bunch of factories that made clothes for the Gap. And at the end of a long day, the guide said, hey, I want to take you to one more that's not on your list. And he said, okay. And so he takes him to this high rise, and they walk up a couple flights and walk into basically an apartment. And he said, it was filthy. There are a bunch of weaving machines, and they're clearly all kids there.
Okay.
And I said, how did you feel when you saw that? That sounds awful. And he said, well, it was, and they didn't supply for Gap. They make stuff for the domestic market.
Right.
And he said it opened up this whole question that I don't even know where to start with of, what do you do about suppliers that aren't held to international standards?
Sure.
And he said, but I did feel like it was one of those moments where I realized that all of the work that we've all been doing for the past 30 years really has made a difference, because if the suppliers that supplied the Gap 30 years ago looked like that,
right,
and I'm pretty sure that they did,
sure,
they don't anymore.
What a great, we're going to run out of time, but I just, to kind of tie this up, because it does seem your work both for BP and at the UN, not that it's thankless, but it's hard. And
and incremental.
Yeah, well, and so that was another thing that I was thinking about. The perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yes.
And you mentioned that a couple of times, that because your compatriots think the same thing. Yeah. We're doing something. Yeah. And it's not overnight, but it's something. Yeah. And we are making progress.
We are. I mean, since, the book came out almost 10 years ago now, and I don't know, Steve, I do have these days where I think, particularly on climate, we don't really have time for incremental work anymore. No. And on human rights, I mean, people are getting hurt today and yesterday. Sure. And so I do recognize that incrementalism is the way that we have to accept that this is how things will change. But it's not enough, and it's not fast enough.
It's not. But there was a comment, and if I get this right, one of the folks that you interviewed said, first we get them to the table, and then we move the table.
That's right. That's right. You have to figure out how to bring people into the conversation.
Right.
Right.
I would, but there was another comment about the optimism of business leaders. Yeah. That they think there's a way, and I think that they're part and parcel. The makeup of somebody who would be foolish enough to start a business and must think that there's an answer. Yeah. That you can do it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And so when I get lots of requests for advice from young people, and now, I'm teaching at Linfield, and we talk a lot about what's the right path forward. And I do really think that people need to experiment and be in different kinds of organizations, because you'll see where you fit. Yeah. Like I worked with lots of activists, and I so respected their ability to hold a really hard line and say, you must not do this, you cannot do this. And I've always been somebody who's like, well, let's see if we can figure out a way, right? But I really think that one has to figure out, where are you best suited? Where's your temperament?
Yeah. Again, that's covered in the book. This is nuts. We're going to have to go. So, I have pages of questions that we're not going to get to this time. I want to say February 24th, the library, McMinnville Library, is hosting a local author event. My hope is that we're there. And you ask your own questions. And get the book. It's just too good to pass up. So Christine Bader, thank you for a too short interview.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.